Our next keynote speaker this morning is Dr. Andrea Brunelle. She is an associate professor and chair in the geography department at the University of Utah. She has a degree in environmental science, geology, as well as quaternary studies in paleoecology, and her PhD is from the University of Oregon in physical geography. Her research focuses on the reconstructions of past environments from lake and wetland sediments, with particular interest in projects with management applications. These projects include reconstructions of fire and vegetation regimes from sedimentary deposits, studying past bark beetle outbreaks in the Mountain West, studies of southwestern desert wetlands, and human paleoecology. Please welcome Dr. Andrea Brunelle.
So thank you so much for having me. I want to express a particular thank you to Darren and to Megan for inviting me and coordinating this. It's always such an honor to come and speak to such a diverse and interesting group. I really enjoy working with land managers, and the fact that everyone would come and listen to this, it's just really inspiring, and it's really a pleasure to be here. So my talk today is, I was trying to bring in the theme of the conference, which when Darren invited me to talk, he said, well, it's going to be on climate and disturbance and restoration. I was like, oh my God, yes. So those are the things I'm totally interested in. We should definitely do that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Just a roadmap, because I'm covering a slightly diverse group of topics. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change, which Rob did a great job of presenting earlier, so it'll be just a little bit of review with less awesome graphics than he had. Conservation, paleoecology, some paleoecological methods, some examples from my research, and then conclusions, and hopefully having some time for discussion with ideas about how we can go forward with this type of collaboration. So when we think about climate change, we have to begin with our atmosphere, and this is just a lovely image of the Earth, and just a reminder that the atmosphere is a very thin layer, which is comprised of largely, as we all know, nitrogen and oxygen, with carbon dioxide and the other gases, including some other greenhouse gases, making up just a tiny percentage of our atmosphere. The greenhouse effect in general, I think, gets a bit of a bad rap, but we have to remember that it's an important part of what makes the Earth such a great place to live. This is what's often called the Goldilocks figure, because here in the middle we have the Earth with just a tiny bit of our greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and a lovely average temperature of about 15 degrees Celsius. If we had less CO2 in the atmosphere, much less, we could be very cold like Mars. I'm sure everybody saw The Martian, right? It was very cold. Or on the other end of the spectrum, Venus, where we have most of their carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and an average temperature of 420 degrees Celsius. So a little bit of greenhouse effect is nice, and we've kind of found the sweet spot here on Earth. So the trouble is when we introduce fossil or old CO2 into our modern budget, right? So we have old carbon stored in the Earth's crust, and it comes from a time period, and this is kind of a joke, right? Coal and gas and oil. But it comes from a time period when the Earth looked very different than it did today. So this is an image from New Zealand, a southern beech forest, but this is what type of vegetation cover was on Antarctica about 40 million years ago, or up until about 40 million years ago. And then something happened. We moved into a greenhouse Earth cycle, much less CO2 in the atmosphere, like what we have today. And we started growing ice on Antarctica and Greenland and so on. So, we know that the Earth has been in different phases when we had more CO2, but right now we're in a phase where we have less. And it's important to keep it that way for humans and the organisms that have come to enjoy this particular climate scenario. So an analogy I like to use when I'm talking about climate change is the idea that greenhouse gas molecules, which absorb long wave or heat energy, are a lot like feathers or down, right, in our comforter. And if we go from an atmosphere like we have now with a certain amount of carbon dioxide, a certain amount of feathers in the quilt, we retain enough heat to keep it a good temperature for us. If we change that, we put more feathers in, then we go back to something like this, right, where the Earth looks much different. We don't have any ice. And the ability of humans and other organisms that we share the planet with can't survive anymore. So how do we know that what we're doing today is different? Well, we have long-term perspectives, and this is a great figure that you've probably seen before. It's an 800,000-year record, a compilation from ice cores, where they've actually been able to measure the carbon dioxide concentrations from gas bubbles stored in that ice. And we can see for the last 800,000 years, we've had variations that range between about 180 and 280 parts per million. And these oscillations occur on a cycle that represents glacial and interglacial cycles. You can tell pretty easily that what we're seeing now far exceeds what we've seen over the last 800,000 years. And then the emission scenarios, again, like Rob presented, are very different, right? Looks very different. We have about 408 parts per million today. A big threshold was crossed on May 14th, 2013, where we hit a global average of 400 parts per million. So with regards to climate change, there's just a few things that I think that are important to keep in mind. One is that greenhouse gases trap this long wave energy in our atmosphere. They do. It's physics. We have evidence that demonstrates that carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases like methane have been accumulating in the atmosphere over the last 100 years or so, since the Industrial Revolution, because we're taking old carbon that's currently stored, and we're adding it to our carbon budget. So we're changing the conditions in the atmosphere. And then again, as was presented earlier, the Earth's average temperature is already warmed by about 1 degree Celsius, and that trajectory is on an upward slope that's expected to increase. And just to bring that home, here's a map that looks at the observed surface changes in temperature from 1900 to 2012. The cooler colors represent cooling, not see too much of that on here. And then the warmer colors represent warming. And to start bringing us closer to home, to the west, we'll zoom in here, and you can see Utah in the western US is definitely in the warmer end of that spectrum. Not quite as warm as the high latitudes, but we already are and are going to continue to be highly impacted. These are a couple of the scenarios for the future. Again, we've seen this. Low carbon emissions, high carbon emissions. You can see the difference by the end of the century between the two. And again, bringing it closer to home, we're already pretty much committed to a couple degrees of warming. And if we stay on that high carbon pathway, we're looking at somewhere between 4 and 7, maybe up to 9 degrees of warming. It's pretty serious. So transitioning into conservation paleobiology, what can we contribute? And conservation paleobiology, it's a newly named field for an existing discipline of paleoecology. And it's basically using records to provide understanding about the natural range of variability, about past climate conditions, so we can understand what's happening today and also potentially make predictions for the future. And it can take a deep time approach. This is, on the bottom panel here, we have a graph with composite oxygen isotopes from sea core records. And it goes back 70 million years to pre-industrial present. And the idea here is that we can detect things like the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum. Again, Rob mentioned it in his talk. This very, very warm time period when we were 12 or 13 degrees Celsius warmer than present. We can detect that in this record. We can also detect changes that represent that switch from a greenhouse climate when we had no ice on the Earth to the icehouse climate that we're currently in about 35 million years ago when the southern beech forest disappeared from Antarctica and ice started to grow. So we can use it for long-term perspectives on the Earth's climate and the range of variability and conditions that lead to these different scenarios. We can also use a more near-time approach, which is what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about today. How can we look at these records of past climate, past vegetation, past environmental conditions, and get information that we can use as a baseline or an understanding of the ranges of variability that systems undergo? This is a photograph from the Mammoth site in Hot Springs, South Dakota, 26,000-year-old mammoth bones, also recovered plant material and pollen to understand what the environment was like when these poor mammoths got stuck. We can use fossils. My favorite proxy of choice, pollen from sediments. So we can also reconstruct environments by using sediment cores and other sedimentary deposits to understand how things have changed in the past. So the basis for sedimentary research is pretty simple. So you'll quickly learn why I didn't go into graphic design. This is my representation of what's happening in the forest. So these little yellow dots are pollen, the black dots are charcoal, and then the beetle, self-explanatory, I think. So the idea is that different plants produce visually different pollen types. You can tell white bark pines from the yellow pines. You can tell sagebrush from grass. We can reconstruct the environment because they look different. Charcoal is produced during fires, and so when you get deposits of charcoal in the lake, you can tell when fires occurred, when more fires occurred. And then if we're really lucky, we get evidence of beetles or other insect outbreaks. And so those things, they're in the air, and they, if we're lucky, land on some depositional surface like a lake or a wetland. And because these settings provide very good preservational environments, they're protected and provide us this record. So they fall in, and then the processes that are happening in the wetland or the lake continue, and so materials falling and sediments accumulating. And we have the oldest stuff at the bottom and the youngest stuff at the top, and the basin is as old as the basin is, right? So at a high elevation subalpine lake, it's probably a post-glacial record, right? It's the last maybe 12,000 years. We have some records for the desert, that go back 36,000 years. So it just depends on how long that setting's been depositional, how long of a record we get. Here's some of the environments we work. This is Emerald Lake from the Wasatch Plateau. I'll be talking more about this lake in a minute. This is Los Ojitos Cienega in Sonora, Mexico, also talking about it a little bit more. This is a bog from Range Creek Canyon near Price, the Fremont Native American records. And then basically to get these records, we take a tube and we stick it in the ground, right? We want to collect continuous records of that entire sediment profile. And there's a couple different ways to do it. This is a Livingston core, which is a meter-long tube that has a piston in it. And the piston serves as a way to keep the sediments in the tube. You can imagine, if you stick your straw in your milkshake and then you pull the straw out, the milkshake falls out, right? But if you stick your straw in the milkshake and you put your finger over the end and you pull it out, the milkshake stays in. So we're using this piston. It slides up the tube and it holds the sediments in. So we can poke this down in the mud, it fills up with the sediment, the piston moves to the top of the core, so when we pull it out, the core stays in the tube until we take it out. In a lake setting, we have to set up an anchored platform in the middle of the lake to do this work because we're working through the water column, and we shuttle back and forth here in our trusty shuttlecraft. Coring is fun. You can ask any of my students, and if I'm in earshot, they'll tell you that it is. This is actually a posed photograph. We were in the Bear River Range, and the shuttlecraft had taken us out, and then they went back to shore to, do some stuff with the gear. And then a moose came up and was very interested in what we were doing, and scared the shuttlecraft crew away into the bushes. And so we sat out here for about an hour taking silly pictures because we'd already collected all the cores, but we couldn't get back because we didn't have another boat. When we collect from wetland regions, we use a slightly different setup. This is called a vibrocore, and it's about as impressive as it sounds. It's a 3-inch diameter irrigation tube hooked up to a cement leveling motor, so it actually vibrates the core down into the sediments. Here we are in southern Arizona at Canelo Hills. This is on a Cloverdale Cienega, also in Arizona. Sometimes you have to put a little bit of weight on it, so that's me and a grad student dangling from the vibrating tube. Some situations, the sediments have too much calcium carbonate in them, or too many gravel layers or sands, and we can't core them. But for both reasons that are lucky and unlucky, many times in the desert we get down cutting because of erosion and heavy flooding that can cut into our deposits. So this flood came through about 3 days before we came out to this site. You can see it laid down all the vegetation in the stream channel, but it did expose the wetland sediments that had previously dried out because of water diversion and down cutting of the stream. So sometimes we just cut the samples right out of a face. In the end, we get mud. One way or the other, we get sediment, and we take it to the lab, and we do a variety of things with it. As I mentioned, we look at charcoal as an indicator of fire. We look at a series of different geochemical proxy, including loss on ignition to get productivity. We look at magnetic susceptibility to measure the ease with which the sediments are magnetized, which gives an idea of erosion. We've also started using X-ray fluorescence to get elemental signatures of our cores. And then, of course, pollen. And I have to point this one out. This is sagebrush up here at the top. Artemisia. There's a grass. That's ephedra. They're like old friends. And the pollen's helpful in one way because you can see shifts in the vegetation through time. So if you start off and you have, so one of these high alpine lakes like I was talking about, and you see, some spruce and maybe some grasses and some herbs. And then at some point, so this is around 12,000 years ago, maybe around 8,000 years ago, all of a sudden you see, lodgepole pine coming in and a shift in the herb community. That's going to tell you something, right? It's going to tell you that you're shifting from a high elevation sort of tree line community to something a little bit warmer. And that makes sense. As you're coming out of the last ice age and into the Holocene, things are going to get warmer. So that's sort of broad scale shifts in vegetation that tell us something about the transitions the environment's going through. We can also get a little bit finer information by using modern climate information about taxa. This is from an atlas that was produced by Thompson et al. In the U.S. Geological Survey, where they took herbs and shrubs, and then they also did trees, and they looked at their modern climate space. So basically, what are the modern climate conditions? So this is Abies lasiocarpa as an example. So you can see, Abies prefers relatively moist. It's on the higher end here. Temperatures, July, mid to lower temperatures. If we compare January to July, it can handle colder January, again, preferring slightly cooler summer temperatures. And then July precipitation to January precipitation, again, we're looking at something on the moisture scale, generally winter precipitation. So subalpine fir, that makes sense, right? If we compare that to, say, Pinus ponderosa pine, you can see that the temperatures that it can tolerate are warmer. And both in July, but January it's a little less tolerant, and its precipitation regime is much broader. It's a much, can handle a much bigger range. So if we flip back and forth, and my favorite thing to do is print out 2 copies of this and then put them together and hold them up to the glass on a window and see, you can actually see what their climate space is, right? So you can actually get a more refined picture of what the quantitative climate change was. How much drier was it if it shifted from subalpine fir to ponderosa pine? How much warmer must it have gotten in the summer in order to facilitate that change? So we can get even better, more quantitative information from these pollen records than just, broad shifts in vegetation change. So for some examples, so all of these projects were worked on in collaboration with land management or restoration groups. So this example is on woody plant encroachment, and this is from that site, Cloverdale Cienega, that I was telling you about in southeastern Arizona, and we were working with Sky Island Alliance on the issue of the Cienega changing, more woody plants being documented coming in onto the Cienega surface, onto the wetland surface, and what was going on there. So here's a map just to locate us. So we're right down here in southeastern Arizona. Here's the Cienega. It's a wetland. And this is, a perspective of it. So you can see in the hills we have, juniper, and we have some cottonwood on the edge. On the very closest edge here, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see young trees kind of creeping out into the grass margin, and then we have, the wetted perimeter here. So it's wet, it's grassy, and then we have the trees on the edge, and what's happening is these trees are slowly creeping on to what used to be the historic sort of wetland grassland community. And in many cases it's oak, but there's also mesquite, things like yucca, and some of the cactus are also encroaching in. So when we were looking at this question, we did a review of the literature. So what do we know about woody plant encroachment in the Southwest? And I found about 7 papers, and they all had a different idea. The idea is that it's naturally variable. It just ebbs and it flows, and it goes from high to low, and it just happens over time. There were some strong opinions about climate change, that it's drought that makes it happen, that it has to do with El Nino, the Southern Oscillation, that has to do with changes in carbon dioxide concentration, that it's because of fire suppression, and that it's because of grazing. And so what we did was we looked at a long-term record from that wetland to try to suss out what really was the control. So on the top panel here, we have the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is a measurement of wet and dry conditions. So when the curve is closer to the top, it's wet, and when it's closer to the bottom, it's dry. In the middle, I have two long-term records of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. One's the Moy et al. 2002, and then a Conroy et al. 2008 in the lighter color. And then in the bottom panel are the paleoecological data that we collected from the site. And they're all plotted on time with present at the left and 5,500 years ago on the right. And in this panel, the blue line represents the encroacher influx. So what I did is I extracted from the pollen counts those taxa that represent woody plants. We also have the charcoal record here in red, and this little line, gray line here towards the end is number of cattle, and then the black line is carbon dioxide concentrations from ice cores. So as we look at the long-term record, the one thing I want to point out to you is that it's on a log scale. These data are on a log scale. So this change in woody plant encroachment you see between 1,500 and 3,500, you might think, oh yeah, definitely, there was a lot of woody plants encroaching during that time period. But actually it's the difference between no woody plants and 10 grains of pollen. So there's really no woody plants to speak of on the system at that time, certainly nearby but not on it. To compare that to the modern influx of woody plant charcoal, which is nearly 100,000 grains. So basically nothing really interesting happens until the last 1,000 years. So we're going to zoom in there and look more closely. So it's all the same proxy, we're just now looking at the last 1,000 years. And so if we look at the Palmer Drought Severity Index or El Nino, there really isn't a compelling relationship between them. We did some different statistical analyses, and there's really nothing there that corresponds well to this very distinctive increase in woody plants. The carbon dioxide does increase, of course, but not until later. Fire is also very level during this time period. The only thing that we could find that really corresponded temporally was when cattle arrive in Arizona. So the cows show up about 300 years ago, and right around that time we see the increase in woody plant encroachment. So we were able to, using this record, go back and evaluate the different hypotheses about woody plant encroachment and really eliminate a lot of these as, at least in this case, is a single case, as the cause, and identify that grazing on Cloverdale cienega really had the strongest connection to the increase in woody plants. So shifting gears a little bit to wetland restoration, including fire and climate. In this case, we were working with the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge, and they were interested in fire. So they have a wetland that's just been hammered. I mean, it's the site that you saw that was so badly downcut. Most of that wetland is dry because the channels have been sized so badly that the water table's much lower. This is due to grazing and water diversion and all kinds of things. But they have been given funding to pump water to the surface on part of the wetland to restore it. And as that wetland is recovering and expanding, it's actually growing. The question is fire part of this ecosystem? Should we be allowing fires to burn? Should we be prescribing fires on there? And so that was the question we were tasked with. And this is a view across the recovered part of the cienega. You can see the pool of water there. And then this is the record that we recovered from the cienega. And so the San Bernardino record is here on the left side in black. And in this scenario, we have time, the way paleoecologists tend to think about it, with the core with present at the top and 8,000 years ago at the bottom. And so the first thing to look at is that, or notice, is that there's really no charcoal on San Bernardino until about 5,000 years ago. And unfortunately, with this record, we started counting at the bottom, so we were really kind of freaking out because there was none. We thought we were doing something wrong. But starting around 5,000 years ago, you can see that it's starting to change, it's increasing, and then after about 4,500 years ago, it maintains pretty steadily with an increase around 1,000 years ago. That helped us to understand that yes, fire is part of these systems, but why was it not prior to about 4,500 years ago? What happened? So we started looking in the literature, and at climate forcing in particular, and came across this Moy 2002 paper that looked at El Nino. And El Nino, the phenomenon, has sort of quiet and active phases. Well, it doesn't sort of, it does. It has quiet and active phases. And prior to about 5,000 years ago, ENSO was quiet. And in the desert Southwest, this means that you're not getting winter precipitation, right? A big El Nino winter in Arizona, for example, is a really good rain year, right? So prior to about 5,000 years ago, we really weren't getting that winter precipitation signal. And Tom Swetnam and Julio Betancourt did some work at higher elevation in the Ponderosa Pine and made a connection between ENSO and fires in that system. And so we think that there's something similar going on, that you really need to have winter precipitation, in this case, to produce those fine fuels that allow deserts to burn, right? Because you can have a lightning strike and it can hit a saguaro and it can flame out, but if there's no fine fuels on the floor of the desert to carry it, it's not going to go anywhere, right? And it's not going to probably be recorded very well. If you have a great El Nino year, a really awesome winter precipitation, you get, what do they call it, the giant bloom, the great bloom, super bloom. People go out to the desert to see it. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Anyway, you get a lot of flowers in the spring after a really good El Nino winter. And what do you think those flowers look like in August in the desert? Fuel, very good, exactly. And so you really need to have that winter precipitation signal in order to have fire in the desert. So we were able to kind of come across two pieces of information that was valuable to the manager at San Bernardino. One, yes, fire is part of the system. And two, this winter precipitation signal is also really important, not only to the Cienega being active and healthy and having water at the surface, but also to providing those fuels for that wetland. Being greedy with mud, we went back and we scored another record, Cloverdale, which I just mentioned, and then Canelo Hills. And what we observed was other connections between El Nino and the wetlands. One is that during this quiet period, even after ENSO turned on and got active, there was a pretty quiet period. And during that time, pollen preservation at Cloverdale went way down. Pollen's preserved under wet anoxic conditions, so if it got dry, if there wasn't much precipitation in the winter and the water table dropped a little bit, those pollen grains would be deteriorated, and that's exactly what we see here. And then we also observed that another smaller wetland at Canelo Hills didn't even initiate until ENSO got very active after about 3,500 years. So in the southwestern desert, the ENSO phenomenon is really important for these wetland settings. It's really exciting to see some of these results in work. This is the Sweetwater wetlands in Tucson, Arizona, and this is just a picture of what they look like. They go out to these wetlands, and one day a year they close them and they burn them to get rid of the matted cattails and the dry vegetation. And they've seen, since they've started doing this, a decrease in invasive species, an increase in diversity, more birds and other organisms utilizing the wetland. So it's been really fun working with this group. Staying in the same geographical area, this is also San Bernardino. This is that flood that came through. But as we know, these floods aren't really supposed to behave this way, right? When a flood hits a wetland, if the wetland's active, it provides the ecological service of slowing down that flood pulse. And you know, the vegetation slows the water down, it drops the sediment, and so you have a depositional rather than an erosional setting. And this looks like chocolate milk. I mean, you can definitely tell this is taking material away. And working with, in this case, it's a group of private landowners, the Austins, who have purchased a lot of this land and then gone in and initiated some restoration projects. And they wanted to work with us because they wanted us to be able to document that the stuff they were doing was working. And their approach was to put in these stone gabions, and they're basically little check dams. So it's, you know, heavy gauge chicken wire or horse fencing that are filled with rocks and put across the stream channels. And so the idea is that as the flood flow comes down, they hit these structures and hopefully it slows the water down a little bit. If you can slow the water down a little bit, you get some sedimentation. If you get some sedimentation, then you get some vegetation, and so it's a positive feedback that you get the water slowing and slowing. And so this is the same scene when they put them in a year or two later, and then a few years after that, and you can see that the vegetation's recovering. You're actually getting pooled standing water following some of the floods, and so it was working. So we went out to one of the sites that they had installed the gabions at 5 years before, and we cored it. and we found 68 centimeters of sediment, no exposed bedrock, fully recovered vegetational setting. And so they were able to use these data to demonstrate that what they were doing was working and get support to continue their restoration efforts in the Arizona-Mexico border region. And then my last example is spruce beetles, outbreaks, but also land use impacts. So, I know there's a lot of people in this room right now that know more about beetles than I do, so I'm going to try to be careful here. This is the work I was telling you about that we were doing on the Wasatch Plateau. This is a shot of Blue Lake, a pretty little lake on the top of this high plateau, and all these dead trees you see around the lake are all spruce, dead spruce that were killed in the 80s during the big spruce beetle outbreak up there. We had over 95% mortality of the mature spruce because of this outbreak. And then the trees you see coming up in the understory are all the non-host species, the fir in this case, that are recovering post-outbreak. So pretty profound visually, right? That's striking. Something interesting happened here. This is the other lake that we worked on from the same setting. Again, you can see in the background all the standing dead spruce, the fir coming up in the understory. And this plateau has a really interesting history. It's not only being affected by, the climate changes that we're seeing elsewhere around the world and in the West in particular, with warmer climates, longer, reproductive cycles for beetles, and whatnot, but it's also been a place where there's been some really interesting land use history. This area was very, very heavily logged in the 1850s with the settlers that came in, preferentially for the spruce because the fir gets a heart rot, I guess, so it's not a very good building material. And it's also been very, very heavily grazed. It was one of the most degraded ecosystems in Utah at one point because of the grazing impacts from the sheep, mainly. So it's been hit pretty hard. So those spruce that were there were all spruce that regenerated following that 1850 era clear cutting that took place. So when the beetles established themselves, they had a single age stand of spruce that was all, at the right flavor and tastiness that they were able to take off really well. So the question was, working with our Forest Service collaborators on this, is this part of the natural range of variability? Do these big outbreaks just occur every so often and we just kind of have to, it's what happens, or is it unusual? And so from those two lakes, and then subsequently some additional lakes we've looked at, and we're also doing the same study with mountain pine beetles in mountain pine beetle settings, pine forests, we've identified what the outbreak signal is. And so in these two panels, we have Emerald Lake on the left and Blue Lake on the right. The top panel is spruce pollen accumulation rate. So how much spruce pollen is coming into the system. So the number of grains from any given taxa gives you a representation of the vegetation density, right? So if you have more spruce, you're gonna have more spruce grains. If you have less spruce, you're gonna have less. And then the lower panel is the ratio of spruce to fir, so the host, non-host, right? So if they're in about equal numbers, it'll be, pretty steady, but something happens to the spruce and that ratio is gonna drop. And so in both settings, we could detect the logging impact very distinctly, not as clearly at Emerald. It had much less fir to start with than Blue Lake, so it's not as clear, a much smaller drop. But then the spruce beetle outbreak is very distinctive at both sites, very unusual. The box and whisker on the left side of each graph represents the prehistoric mean and range of what that looked like to demonstrate, is what we're seeing today unusual? And it really is. These outbreaks that we've been seeing in the spruce system and in many pine systems really don't look like anything we've seen over the last 5 or 10 or even 15,000 years. So there is something different, and it probably has to do with climate change, the ability of the beetles to reproduce more quickly, but then also the fact that we've changed the way the forest looks, right? It's a very different forest and likely more susceptible. So conclusions, what can we take from this? Getting back to the, kind of the 3 key things of the meeting, climate. There's variability, but then there's also climate change. So there's this, range of variability that we know exists, but then there's also climate change happening. And so the hope is that conservation paleobiology or paleoecological records, that by getting these long-term records, we can understand both what the natural range of variability is, but then also be able to provide a scale or a point of departure for what things look like now and how it's different. Disturbance, we have lots of ways of reconstructing past disturbances, floods, beetle outbreaks, fires, and hopefully, again, understanding what the baseline looked like prior to climate change and land use impacts, we can understand how what we're working with now is different. And then restoration. Restoration, is an important goal. What are we restoring to? What should it look like? What processes are we trying to recreate or reintroduce on the landscape? Bringing fire back in or creating more uneven age stands so that they're less susceptible to outbreaks. But then also adaptation. Rob did a great job of talking about mitigation. I think we get to a point where adaptation is likely impossible, but I think we're still in the realm, and if we get on the right track as far as greenhouse gas emissions go, I think there's hope. And so understanding what things have looked like in the past, how they've changed now, and then looking towards the future, how can we continue to manage these lands for multiple use. Thank you.
Question. What's your sense of how well the pollen in the lake or wetland characterizes A, the catchment, and then B, the broader landscape? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the spatial variation and how that may or may not change based on your core sample in the wet area.
Okay, so the question was, how well does the pollen represent the local vegetation and how that might change up and down the core with preservation?
How it might change spatially within the catchment,
okay,
and then across a broader region at a further distance or outside the catchment.
Okay, so that's a good question, and pollens, it's interesting because we do have biases. There are pollen types such as the pines, which have the body of the pollen with the reproductive material in it, but then they also have air bladders because they're designed to travel very far from the source. So that's something we have to consider, is that you can have pine pollen at a site where there's not a pine for 20 miles. That said, we know what the many of these biases are between wind and insect pollinated plant types. And we also eliminate some of these biases by creating these ratios. So really identifying taxa, like we're looking for something that represents, the wettest and dry, or wettest and coolest part of the record, or taxa on the landscape, or the warmest and driest. So then we create ratios between them to create an index of, temperature or moisture or whatever. So palynology has a long history, and many calibration studies have been done. We're actually still working on them. We're working on one in my lab right now. But the consensus in the community is that they do a very good job of representing what the local vegetation is, and that you can calibrate out biases because we do have an understanding of different strategies. As far as looking at it on a more regional scale, we tend to like to create regional pictures by aggregating more local records. So we take multiple watersheds in a given area and try to create a regional picture by comparing those. Because I think when you try to take, say something about a very large area from a single site, then you really are making yourself vulnerable to not really understanding where the sources are and what's happening with the production of pollen.
You showed a strong signal that in the last study related to logging impacts. How much you expect that to be similar or different to any past large severe county fires that would have essentially reduced the forest in a similar way?
That's a great question. So how do we tell the difference between, say, the beetle outbreak or the logging impact from a crown fire? So what I showed you was the pollen accumulation rate of spruce. So in a fire, that would go down for spruce, it would go down for all the taxa. And that's why we also look at it with a ratio, because in the host-non-host ratio, something's going to do better because of the beetle outbreak. In a fire, everything goes down, right? And then you also can look for successional signals, so we can also extract that. So it's really just knowing what taxa are going to be affected by a given disturbance, and then really, focusing in on their responses following it. So fires end up looking very different from.
Part of my question is, because you have a much longer record than what you showed us there,
Mm-hmm.
that you established your long-term
Yes.
means. Were there events in the past, in the longer past, that you could identify that look similar as far as in terms of large fire events like that? And did you do charcoal to confirm?
Yes, we did do charcoal for all of those records, and we did identify fire events, but the fire events have a very different signal where everything goes down. We didn't see anything that looked like that fingerprint, where it's a specific taxa decreasing at that magnitude in the past. Okay, thank you.